Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of IOHR TV. During this pandemic, fake news has been spread to exploit fear, divide people, as well as to deliver specific political agendas. Today, I'm interviewing Nina Jankowicz, Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, to find out more about the most common misinformation narratives surrounding this virus and the role of Russian media outlets during this pandemic. Nina Jankowicz, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nina, this pandemic has been described by the World Health Organization's Director General as an infodemic. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I do think it is an infodemic. We have this proliferation of dis and misinformation, not only being shared by foreign actors, which I think a lot of people probably would expect during this time, but people using the pandemic for political purposes in a lot of different countries, people trying to use it for monetary gain, and other people who are just trying to cause chaos, unfortunately. And what makes this pandemic unique and makes it an infodemic of the likes of which we've not seen before is that people are scared. This virus is so new. There's a lot of people who are looking for information about this virus and how to protect themselves, how to protect their loved ones. And so there's a great need, and the media to some extent are feeding that need. But in some areas, of course, there are people who don't believe the mainstream media and are searching for other sources of information, which is where we have all of these dis and misinformation narratives coming up through closed parts of the internet like Facebook groups or from fringe media outlets that people are buying into in this very scary time. And that's what disinformation runs on. It runs on emotional manipulation and fear, and there's plenty of that to go around right now.
What kind of fake narratives have been spread?
I think it's interesting to hone in on the protests that have been going on in the United States over the past week or so to reopen the economy. And when you look into these protests, there's a lot of different types of disinformation that are mixed in there. There's health mis and disinformation where people are anti-vaccine and think somehow this pandemic has been unleashed in order to force everyone to get a vaccine that will then have a microchip in it, and there's tracking involved in it. It's pretty crazy. But there's also people who think that the opposite is true, that, the entire pandemic is being overblown by the mainstream media in order to cripple the economy before the 2020 election, which is also not true. There is, QAnon conspiracy theories mixed in with some of the disinformation here. We saw some of the protesters this past weekend carrying QAnon signs, and that conspiracy theory is many, many layers deep and would take us all our time here today to describe. But again, they think there's some sort of secret cabal working against President Trump to unleash this virus. There are people who think, and now this is kind of going to the foreign side of things, but people who think that the United States released this virus, that it was created in a lab. There are other folks who believe that China created it in a lab to cripple the United States. And then underneath all of this, we actually have a technical disinformation campaign, which is supporting this movement to make it look like a grassroots campaign, but is actually an astroturfing campaign where some people have bought up domains and created Facebook groups, all of which are identical, to make it look like this movement to reopen the economy has more support than it actually does. But if you look at the polling, most people want to stay home until it's safe for us to go outside again.
You have said many times that the creators of fake news play with people's feelings and emotions. How do they do that?
So I think there is a misconception that fake news and disinformation is always something that's just patently untrue, that it's, a fake website or a fake news story, when in reality, the most successful disinformation campaigns that we've seen throughout time have always bought into that emotional element. They need to ring true for people to some degree in order for people to actually not only read and agree with them, but to spread them and amplify them. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So again, people are scared about what's going to happen. They're scared about their health, their loved ones' health. They're scared about what's going to happen with their jobs or their savings. And they're looking for answers. And sometimes when they're looking for answers, they are able to see something that rings true to their own personal experience in this disinformation. And again, that doesn't matter whether it's coming from bad actors that are foreign actors like Russia or China, or folks here who are looking to take advantage of people who are fearful. And we're seeing that coming from, I think, if we imagine a person getting information from all sides, it's certainly happening in this situation where you're not only getting disinformation from the Trump administration, you're getting disinformation from Russian television, and you're getting disinformation from certain networks and publications in the United States, unfortunately. And I think that's true in many informational environments around the world.
You are an advocate for informational distancing. What do you mean by that?
So I thought of the term informational distancing when I was trying to come up with a snappy way to tell people how to disengage from content online. This is something that I always talk about, even outside of an infodemic. I think people, again, are unaware that they're being emotionally manipulated. And that's not only with disinformation, it has to do with the clickbait headlines that we've seen that kind of make the internet run and drive the ad tech industry these days. So now that we're familiar with this term, social distancing, keeping physical distance from people, informational distancing is a logical follow-on to that, because we are being emotionally manipulated. If people are starting to feel a sense of fear or a sense of anger, or perhaps even joy if they see a policy that they like, although I think that's very rare these days. It's a good time to consider the source and to walk away from your device and say, why is this being served to me? Am I being targeted by an ad here? How did this show up in my feed? What is the source of this information, and what do they have at stake in this informational crisis? Are they trying to make money? Are they trying to push a political, some sort of political narrative? Why are they doing this? And then, after taking some deep breaths and considering why you're feeling these emotions, it's okay to go back, dive back in, and then check the sources. See if anyone else is reporting this. See, for instance, if there's anything else like this showing up in your Facebook feed, if the source there, if the source of the information, the journalist or the actual outlet itself is reputable, and there are ways to do that people can engage in.
You have focused most of your work on Russia. A recent EU document states that a significant disinformation campaign by Russian state media and pro-Kremlin outlets regarding COVID-19 is ongoing and aims to worsen the impact of the coronavirus in the West, generate panic, and sow distrust. Would you agree?
So I don't obviously have the documents that they were working with on the back end, but from what I've seen of the Russian campaign so far, from overt propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik, and from the statements of Russian officials themselves, I actually think, although there is always an element of trying to undermine the West in any Russian disinformation campaign, I think in this case, the actual audience is more the Russian people, and to bolster support for Putin during this time, to bolster support for not democratic regimes, for authoritarian regimes, because he's obviously struggling with the coronavirus pandemic just like everyone else is. And I think it's an ideal time for him to point to the United States, to point to Great Britain, two countries that have been, beacons for how democracy should work and support their citizens, both of which are really struggling during this time. And again, disinformation grounded in truth and emotion. It's hard to, push back against that narrative that we are struggling, because it's true, we are. And, in the information environment that Putin exists in, he's able to suppress that information about the struggles that the Russian Federation is having and say, look at what a good job we're doing. Look at what the United States is doing. We just sent them a plane full of aid, which they did a couple of weeks ago, masks and other ventilators and things like that to the United States. The United States, which used to give aid to Russia, and now the Russian Federation is giving aid to the United States. So I see the main goal there as bolstering the Putin regime. And of course, there is a little bit of denigrating of the West there. There have been narratives seeded in Europe, especially about American troops stationed in Central and Eastern Europe that supposedly, allegedly were spreading coronavirus because they didn't have masks and things like that. That's all obviously untrue and is meant to undermine confidence in the United States writ large. But I think that the primary audience here is the Russian people. And I think to some degree, you can see that mirrored in China's strategy as well.
With regards to Russia, do you think there's anything different about the disinformation about COVID-19, or do you think that it follows a similar pattern to disinformation campaigns carried out by the Kremlin in the past?
I think it's a very similar pattern to what we've seen in the past, but this is a fissure in society. Again, it's playing on people's emotions. All of the Russian campaigns that we've seen, whether they've been in Central and Eastern Europe, in places like, Africa or South America, or here in the United States, or in Western Europe for that matter, have focused on these societal fissures, these crisis moments, these hot button political issues, which are grounded in emotion. And again, ultimately hope to denigrate the Western democratic order and bolster Putin at home and his seat in the global negotiating table, right? So I think to that degree, it's very similar. Of course, the narratives will differ from campaign to campaign based on the event that is being exploited, but in terms of the motives and in terms of the general tactics, it's very similar to what we've been seeing for the past, several years. So what's different in terms of the structure now is that the social media companies have put up a few hurdles for disinformers so that it's harder to amplify and spread malign narratives than it was about 4 years ago. And that drives the conversation underground into places like private and secret groups, like encrypted messengers, like other smaller forums that have less content moderation, including 4chan, 8chan, Gab, Reddit. And that's where a lot of these narratives are being seeded and proliferated now. And that applies not only to foreign disinformation campaigns, but those that are begun within our domestic borders as well.
And finally, what do you think needs to be done to help people verify the information they consume?
Obviously, there needs to be a whole of society response to disinformation. So far, we've kind of just played whack-a-troll, where we're deleting bad accounts and bad content, and we're letting the social media companies kind of take care of that on their own, and it's not really working. There's also a little bit of government-to-government communication about this stuff with sanctions on Russia for their role in the 2016 election, et cetera, et cetera. But in all of the responses that I've seen, and this is part of my book where I look at different governments in Central and Eastern Europe and how they've responded to Russian disinformation, there's always, in those countries that have had success, a citizens-based element to their response. So whether that's education or, in the case of a country like Estonia, societal integration of the Russian population, there's always something about bringing citizens together and educating them. And I think we in the United States in particular have been really slow to adopt such techniques because we think we have a good education system. We think people are reasonably civically active. But actually, a lot of the dis and misinformation that we saw in 2016 stemmed from a lack of understanding about how the primary process was working. So we need to educate people about that, clearly. But there's also a lack of understanding about how the informational environment works today. Not only how easy it is to impersonate someone online, but also how easy it is to, for instance, target an ad to someone at a very minuscule level. People don't understand how information gets to them on Facebook and Twitter. So educating them about that, but also educating them in basic media literacy skills so that they understand how to fact check, how to do a gut check of information on the internet, and protect themselves and be more informed citizens. And I think there are a lot of ways to do that. I think the social media companies have a role to play. They're making billions of dollars a year trafficking in our information. So I think they should be giving back to the user communities that they rely on. And they should be doing that with expert advice from people in civil society and academia, education, who know how this stuff works. There's also a large, professional development opportunity here. We all have to take courses in IT security and things like that. But there have been governments in Europe that start educating their civil servants about disinformation and fake news, about cyber espionage and things like that. And I think we could all stand to learn a little bit more about that from a strictly nonpartisan perspective, in a way that's just meant to protect ourselves and our personal information online. And then I also think there's a role for libraries to play. The library system in the United States is extremely robust. It's looking for, its new raison d'etre in the digital era. And libraries are still really fairly highly trusted here. So I think that's a way that we could educate people, get into rural communities, again, from a strictly nonpartisan point of view, just trying to arm people with more information.
Nina Jankowicz, thank you.
It's been great to chat with you.
And thank you for being with us for another episode of IOHR TV. From myself, Margherita Kargasaki, until next time, goodbye.